A low, humid dawn settles over New Orleans. Street lamps flicker as if struggling to stay awake. The city exhales, unaware that it is about to be addressed by something that does not believe itself human. On the morning of March 14, 1919, doorsteps across New Orleans received the same object. Fresh ink pressed into thin paper, folded neatly, ordinary in appearance. By noon, it would feel anything but ordinary. Printed on the front page of the city's most trusted daily was a message that did not come from authority, nor fame, nor power. It came from the thing responsible for a year of shattered doors, crushed skulls, and blood soaking into bedroom floors. A presence that slipped through the city after midnight and vanished before sunrise. For the first time, the killer was not hiding. He was speaking. The letter announced itself with theatrical arrogance, dated from a place it claimed was not of this world. The voice behind the words mocked the living, dismissed the police, and boasted of its invisibility. Not unseen, unseeable. It rejected flesh and bone, declaring itself a force, a shadow, something born of heat and punishment. This was no confession, it was a performance. As readers scanned the page, sipping coffee in quiet kitchens, a realization crept in slowly and then all at once. This was not merely a murderer enjoying attention. This was someone, or something, constructing a myth around itself, a demon with a sense of humor, a predator who wanted to be feared not just for what it did, but for what it claimed to be. And then the tone shifted. The letter did not merely taunt, it issued an ultimatum. At a precise moment, just after midnight on the following Tuesday, the writer promised to move through the city once more. But this time it offered mercy, a bargain, a ritual of survival, music. Not prayers, not locks, not police patrols, jazz. Every household, the letter declared, that filled itself with live music, horns blaring, drums pounding, bodies moving, would be spared. Any home that sat in silence, any room where the night remained still, would be marked. There was no ambiguity, no metaphor. If the city did not play, the axe would fall. The message ended simply, signed with a name that had already become a whisper passed from neighbor to neighbor, from priest to patrolman. The Axeman. This was no prank. Authorities confirmed it quietly, grimly. Details embedded in the text aligned with evidence never released to the public. The author knew too much, intimate knowledge. The kind gained only by standing in those rooms, by feeling the weight of the weapon in hand. New Orleans froze. The city had already been living in fear, doors barricaded, windows nailed shut, families sleeping in shifts. Now it faced a question no city should ever have to answer. Do you refuse a monster and risk inviting it inside? Or do you obey and survive another night? 5 days later, on March 19, 1919, the answer arrived not in words, but in sound. Before we step into that night, understand this. What follows is not folklore. It is not legend shaped by time. These events unfolded in real streets, behind real doors, among people who had no reason to believe evil could announce itself so openly. Tonight, we descend into a city already wounded by history. We will trace the footprints left in blood and splintered wood. We will examine the message that turned terror into ritual. And we will stand still as an entire city reached for music, not for joy, but for survival. This is not simply the tale of a killer who vanished. It is a study of fear made communal, of dread transformed into defiance, of how beauty can echo through darkness when silence becomes too dangerous. To understand the figure who called himself the Axeman, we must first return to the city he stalked, New Orleans in 1918, because when he emerged, the city was already bleeding. A city already dressed in black wakes each morning to new names carved into its memory. By 1918, New Orleans had given its sons to a distant war across the ocean. Thousands marched away beneath waving banners. Too many never returned. Those who did came back altered, eyes hollow, voices lowered, carrying stories of mud-filled trenches, screaming artillery, and nights that never truly ended. Their words peeled away any remaining illusion that civilization was gentle. But even as the guns fell silent in Europe, another enemy was tightening its grip. It moved without uniforms, without borders, without mercy. The influenza swept through the world like an ancient curse, invisible and unstoppable. In New Orleans, it killed with terrifying speed. Hundreds died each week. Hospitals overflowed. Morgues could not contain the dead. Coffins ran out. Graves were dug wide instead of deep. People covered their mouths in public. They crossed streets to avoid one another. A simple cough could empty a room. Death was no longer something that arrived at night. It floated in the air, settled on doorknobs, lingered in breath. The city was exhausted, spiritually bruised, already mourning, and then something else arrived. This new terror could not be blamed on disease. It did not come from empires or battlefields. It did not strike at random. It came deliberately, patiently after midnight. It carried an axe. This was the moment when fear took a new shape. The first confirmed nightmare unfolded on May 22, 1918. Joseph Maggio was 41 years old. Alongside his wife, Catherine, he operated a modest grocery on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia, an unremarkable wooden structure in a neighborhood shaped by Italian immigrants who had carved out a life through stubborn endurance. The shop occupied the ground floor. Their home rested directly above it, work and rest under one roof. Safety, they believed, built into familiarity. They were not rich, they were not powerful. But they were decent, known, trusted, church-going, a married couple who locked up at night and believed in routine. That evening they closed the store as they always did, bolted the doors, extinguished the lamps, climbed the stairs to bed. They never heard him enter. Morning came quietly. Joseph's brothers arrived early to help open the shop. When repeated knocking brought no answer, concern sharpened into fear. They unlocked the door with a spare key and climbed the stairs. What they found stopped time. Joseph and Catherine lay in their bed, soaked in darkened crimson. Their throats had been opened with surgical precision. Catherine's wound was so severe her head rested at an impossible angle, nearly detached from her body. Joseph was still alive, barely. His breaths came as wet, choking sounds. He was drowning where he lay, blood filling his lungs with every shallow inhale. The brothers screamed. Neighbors poured into the street. Someone ran for the police. Someone prayed. Officers arrived and began their search. In the bathroom, propped casually against the wall, they found the weapon, not brought from outside, not discarded in haste. It belonged to the victims. The Maggio's own axe was slick with blood, its handle stained from repeated blows. The killer had used it to crush their skulls while they slept. Only after rendering them helpless had he taken Joseph's straight razor, retrieved calmly from the bathroom, and finished the work. But the most disturbing detail waited at the back of the apartment. The rear door leading to the alley behind the store had not been forced open. It had been worked on. A wooden panel had been carefully removed, chiseled out with patience and control. No splintering, no panic, no rush. This was not a crime of impulse. This was preparation. The city would soon realize this was not an isolated horror. It was an introduction. The opening in the door was not crude. It was not the work of panic or rage. A section of wood had been removed with careful precision, measured, deliberate, just wide enough for a human arm to slip through and unlatch the door from the inside. Someone had stood there in the dark, tools in hand, working patiently, while the Maggios slept only feet away. Joseph Maggio never made it to the hospital. His body gave up before the ambulance arrived, leaving behind only questions soaked in blood. As officers combed the scene, searching for anything that could explain what had happened, one of them stepped outside and froze. Written on the sidewalk just beyond the groceries entrance was a message scrawled hastily but intentionally. A sentence meant to be seen, meant to be understood. It referenced another woman. Another death. The officers exchanged looks. They recognized the name immediately. 7 years earlier, in 1911, a woman known as Mrs. Tony, her full name Mrs. Tony Siambra, had been butchered in her bed. She and her husband operated a grocery store. They lived above it. The attacker had entered at night, used an axe, vanished without a trace. That case had never been solved, and now, standing in the gray morning light, the police felt a slow, sinking realization take hold. This was not the beginning. This was a continuation. Something had been waiting, patient, dormant, watching. If the message was to be believed, then whatever stalked New Orleans had been there for years, slipping in and out of history like a shadow, and it had never stopped hunting. The investigation into the Maggio murders unraveled quickly. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no strangers seen fleeing into the night, nothing that could be turned into an arrest. Fear gripped the Italian neighborhoods first, but beyond those streets, the city clung desperately to denial. Authorities floated explanations meant to soothe. A robbery gone wrong, a personal feud, an isolated act of violence, anything but the truth. They would not have long to pretend. Just over a month later, on the morning of June 27, 1918, police were summoned to another grocery. This one belonged to a Polish immigrant named Louis Bessumer. He lived above the shop with a woman named Harriet Lowe. Inside, the scene felt horrifyingly familiar. The back door bore the same signature wound, wood carefully removed, entry gained without a sound. An axe taken from the property, two people attacked in their sleep. Blood coated the floors, walls, bed linens, but this time someone survived. Harriet Lowe drifted in and out of consciousness, her words slurred, her grip on reality fraying. Through labored breaths, she made an accusation that sent investigators down a dangerous path. She claimed Louis Bessumer had attacked her. More than that, she claimed he was a German spy. Context mattered. This was 1918. America was at war. Suspicion of espionage was everywhere. Fear had trained people to see enemies in familiar faces. Desperate for clarity, the police arrested Bessumer. But the story collapsed under scrutiny. If he was the attacker who had altered the door, why would he quietly chisel an entrance into his own home? Why repeat the exact method used in the Maggio killings? None of it fit. Harriet Lowe died days later. Her final words, rambling claims of espionage and betrayal, only deepened the confusion. Eventually, Bessumer was released, and once again the truth reemerged from beneath the noise. The real killer had never been caught. By the summer of 1918, a pattern could no longer be ignored. The victims shared striking similarities. Nearly all were Italian grocers or members of their households, small business owners, immigrants who lived where they worked, families who had clawed stability from uncertainty. The attacks came after midnight, when homes were silent and bodies defenseless. Entry was always achieved the same way, through a rear door, usually facing an alley or unlit street. A section of wood removed patiently, silently. This took time, skill, tools. The weapon was never brought. It was always taken from the victim's own property, an axe lifted from a woodpile or storage area. And nothing was ever stolen. No money, no valuables, no goods. Robbery was not the motive. So what was? Revenge? Extortion? A hidden war within immigrant communities, or a mind governed by a logic no one else could see? The city did not have answers, but it had fear. And on the night of August 5th, 1918, the thing calling itself the Axeman struck twice. A single night can fracture a city beyond repair. August 5th, 1918 did not begin with screams. It began with sleep. The first home stood behind a small grocery at the corner of 2nd and Jefferson Streets. A young family lived there, Charles and Rosie Cortamiglia, newly married, building something fragile and hopeful. Their daughter, Mary, was only 2 years old, barely old enough to speak, barely old enough to dream. In the early hours before dawn, a neighbor heard a sound that did not belong to the night: screaming. By the time police arrived, the house had gone quiet again. All three had been attacked with an axe. Mary lay still, her tiny skull crushed beyond recognition. The violence inflicted on her was so extreme it defied explanation. Charles and Rosie were found alive, but barely, broken bodies clinging to breath by instinct alone. At the hospital, Rosie drifted between consciousness and darkness. Through pain and shock, she gave police a name. Not a stranger, not a shadow. Their neighbors, a father and son who lived next door. The accusation was immediate, firm, repeated. Authorities acted quickly, too quickly. The men were arrested without delay. Rosie insisted they were responsible, motivated by jealousy, by resentment, by some vague dispute that could never quite be defined. But the story began to unravel almost as soon as it was told. Investigators searched the accused men's home. They found no blood, no stained clothing, no signs of a brutal, close-range attack that should have left evidence everywhere. More troubling still, the signature was missing. There was no chiseled panel, no silent point of entry, nothing that matched the method now haunting the city. And then came the detail that should have stopped everything. That same night across town, another man was attacked. Joseph Romano, an elderly grocer, was struck in his bed with an axe. He lingered for 2 days before dying from his injuries. His nieces, sleeping nearby, heard the assault and rushed toward the sound. They saw the attacker. A tall, broad-shouldered figure dressed in dark clothing, a slouched black hat pulled low, running into the night. The description did not match the men already in custody, not even close. But Rosie Cortamiglia never recanted, and the machinery of justice, once set in motion, refused to stop. The father and son were tried, convicted, sent to prison. 2 innocent lives erased while the true killer remained free, and everyone knew it because the attacks did not end. The summer of 1918 became a season of whispered terror. Homes were breached. Families were butchered. Survivors woke screaming in blood-soaked beds. The police chased theories that collapsed under scrutiny. They had no weapon, no suspect, no face to attach to the violence. The Italian immigrant neighborhoods lived in constant dread. People slept with knives and pistols beneath their pillows. Some abandoned their homes entirely, crowding into relatives' houses or fleeing the city. Doors were reinforced, windows barricaded, lights burned all night in defiance of the dark. None of it mattered. The killer moved like vapor. He left no trail. He came when the city slept, and then, without warning, it stopped. Autumn arrived, then winter. The influenza continued its relentless harvest, but the midnight attacks ceased. Weeks passed, then months. No chiseled doors, no axes lifted from woodpiles, no bodies found at dawn. Hope crept back in, fragile and cautious. Had the killer died in the pandemic, moved on, simply vanished, the city dared to believe the nightmare was over. They were wrong. In March of 1919, a plain envelope arrived at the offices of the city's most trusted newspaper. No return address, no warning. Inside were several handwritten pages composed in steady, deliberate script. The editor who opened it likely expected nonsense, a hoax, a cruel joke resurrecting old fears. But as he read, the air seemed to thicken. The letter spoke in a voice that was theatrical, mocking, and deeply unsettling. It claimed authorship of the previous summer's horrors. It referenced crime scene details never shared with the public, private facts, intimate knowledge, things only the killer or the police could know. This was no prank. The editor contacted authorities immediately. Detectives arrived, compared the contents against their records, and reached the same conclusion. The letter was authentic. The silence had not been an ending. It had been an intermission. Now the killer had chosen to speak, not to law enforcement, but directly to the people of New Orleans. A debate followed behind closed doors. Publishing the letter would ignite panic. It would confirm the worst fear, that the monster was still present, still watching, still capable of striking again. But the message contained a threat, a deadline. If the paper stayed silent and people died without warning, the guilt would be unforgivable. The decision would change the city forever. The choice was made behind closed doors, in hushed voices heavy with dread. On the morning of March 14, 1919, the city awoke to words that felt less like ink on paper and more like a summoning. The front page carried no warning, no buffer of context, only a message laid bare, as if daring the reader to look away. New Orleans was reading the voice of its predator. What follows is not interpretation, not rumor. It is the message as it appeared, one of the most unnerving documents ever printed in American criminal history. The tone is deliberate, controlled. Mocking, it does not rage. It performs. The author announces himself from a place he names as hell, addressing the city as though it were beneath him. He boasts of invisibility, not metaphorical but absolute. He denies humanity entirely, rejecting flesh in favor of something older, something infernal. He claims the name the city has already given him. He promises future deaths, chosen only by him, and assures the reader that no evidence will ever follow except the familiar sight of an axe soaked in what he describes with grotesque intimacy. Then comes the contempt. He ridicules law enforcement with a precision that cuts deeper than insult. He praises their incompetence. He laughs at their caution. He warns them not to seek his nature, suggesting that the knowledge itself would be fatal. This is not chaos spilling onto the page. This is confidence. The references embedded in the letter are deliberate and erudite. He invokes figures of power and empire, fallen monarchs of Europe, weaving world events into his mythology. This is a writer who expects his audience to understand him, who assumes education, who takes pleasure in superiority, and then the letter shifts again. The voice grows almost playful. He admits to being a murderer but frames it as restraint, that if he wished, the deaths could be uncountable, that he holds back only by choice, that he walks alongside death itself. And then, precisely measured, he names a time. 12:15, not midnight, not dawn, a deliberate moment suspended between days. On the following Tuesday night, he promises to move through the city once more, but this time he offers mercy, a bargain. He professes a fondness for music, specifically jazz, and swears by infernal powers that any household filled with live sound at that exact moment will be spared. Brass, rhythm, movement, noise. Silence, however, will be punished. Any home that does not play it out, as he phrases it, will feel the axe. Read that slowly. An entire city commanded to perform a ritual at a precise minute under threat of death. Nothing like it had ever been recorded. Criminals had written to newspapers before. Some had taunted. Some had confessed. But never had a killer attempted to choreograph the behavior of a population this large. Never had terror been so theatrical or so specific. The letter closes with a flourish, declaring himself eternal, unmatched, and eager to return to the infernal warmth from which he claims to originate. It is signed simply, the Axeman. When the paper hit the streets, the reaction was immediate. Chaos rippled outward from breakfast tables and cafe counters. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as a tasteless hoax, a stunt. Ink designed to sell papers. But the police spoke quickly and grimly. The letter was real. Its author knew too much. He had not struck with a weapon this time, they said, but the effect was the same. Fear spread faster than blood ever could. For others, disbelief was not an option. New Orleans was a city steeped in faith and ritual. Catholic prayers whispered alongside older traditions. Spirits, omens, curses, these were not abstract ideas. They were part of the cultural bloodstream. If something claimed to be a demon, people listened. Churches filled. Candles burned. Confessions stretched long into the night. Some prayed for forgiveness. Others prayed simply to be overlooked. Because whether the writer was man or monster no longer mattered. What mattered was this. Tuesday night was coming, and the city had been warned. Fear does not always flee into silence. Sometimes it seeks answers in the unseen. In the days that followed the letter's publication, New Orleans fractured into ritual and superstition. Fortune tellers found their parlors overflowing. Candles burned low in back rooms thick with incense. Protective charms were sewn into clothing, nailed above doorways, whispered over in half-forgotten languages. The Italian neighborhoods, already scarred by loss, were paralyzed. 5 days. That was all they had. 5 days to decide whether survival meant obedience. Do they fill the night with sound or dare the silence and wait for the axe? The city chose noise. Music shops were stripped bare within hours. Records vanished from shelves. Sheet music sold faster than it could be printed. Instruments, trumpets, clarinets, drums, were bought by people who had never touched them before. Anything that could produce something resembling jazz was suddenly priceless. A local composer seized the moment and turned terror into melody, releasing a song inspired directly by the threat. The cover illustration was grotesque and playful at once, a wild-eyed figure clutching an axe, surrounded by dancing notes. The city laughed nervously as it bought thousands of copies. Fear had become a commodity. As Tuesday, March 19th, crept closer, dread tangled itself with anticipation. This would not be a normal night. It could not be. When the sun finally sank beneath the horizon, New Orleans did not grow quiet. It began to hum. Music spilled from dance halls first, then clubs, then any place with space enough for bodies and breath. Doors were thrown open. Bands played without pause. Some venues hired musicians simply to ensure the sound never stopped. In packed rooms thick with sweat and smoke, a 17-year-old cornet player named Louis Armstrong lifted his instrument and blew into the night. His notes joining a citywide chorus born of desperation. But the sound did not belong only to professionals. Inside ordinary homes, families gathered around record players still warm from purchase. Needles scratched across vinyl, producing warped echoes of jazz that barely resembled the real thing, but no one cared. Some hired small bands to set up in parlors and kitchens. Others pounded on pots and pans, clapped their hands, stomped their feet, inventing rhythm where none existed. Parents kept children awake long past bedtime, too afraid to let them sleep. Pajamas became dance clothes. Laughter shook loose from terror. The entire city stayed awake. The entire city played. As midnight approached, the volume rose not by design but by instinct. People watched clocks with widening eyes. Every passing minute tightened the air. 12:15, that was the moment. That was when he said he would come. Imagine it, a warm March night. Windows thrown open, light spilling onto sidewalks, jazz pouring from every direction, trumpets, clarinets, pianos, drums, human voices raised in defiant chaos. Thousands danced. Some laughed too loudly, Some prayed without stopping. Some drank as if courage could be swallowed. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was a city performing a spell it barely believed in, hoping sound could protect flesh. And when the clock struck 12:15, the music surged. For a moment, New Orleans became a single thunderous heartbeat. Then came waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The night stretched on, heavy and uncertain. Eventually, exhaustion replaced fear. One by one, the sounds softened. People dared to sit, to breathe. Morning came, and with it the truth. There were no new bodies, no broken doors, no blood-stained bedrooms. The axe had not fallen. Relief washed over the city in waves, followed by laughter, tears, and something dangerously close to triumph. New Orleans had stared into the dark and lived. They had danced with death and survived. But survival raised new questions. Did the killer truly spare them because they played? Or had he never intended to strike that night at all? Was the letter merely a game? A demonstration of control so absolute that he could command an entire city without lifting a weapon? Did he sit somewhere in the dark, listening, smiling at the chaos he orchestrated? Or, most unsettling of all, was he there among them, moving through the French Quarter, blending into the crowd, dancing to the very music he demanded? Was the Axeman a guest at his own celebration? We will never know. What we do know is this: the letter achieved something no blade ever could. It turned a murderer into a legend. It transformed a man into a myth, into a demon capable of bending an entire city to his will. And perhaps that was the true goal all along, not just to kill, but to be remembered, to become immortal. If immortality was the goal, it had already been achieved. For a time after the night of music, the city exhaled. Days passed, then weeks. No doors carved open in the dark. No families found broken at dawn. No ink-stained threats crawling across the front pages. Hope, reckless and fragile, returned. Some whispered that the performance had satisfied him. Others insisted he had moved on, carrying his hunger to another city. A few dared to believe the nightmare had simply burned itself out. They misunderstood the nature of what stalked them. This was not an ending, it was an interlude. When the violence returned in the suffocating heat of the summer of 1919, it would erase any illusion of protection. Music had not saved the city. It had only entertained the monster. Spring bled into summer. April dissolved into May, then June, then July. The silence stretched unnaturally long. No letters, no warnings, no bodies, but normal no longer existed. The influenza was finally loosening its grip, but it had already claimed thousands. Soldiers were drifting home from the war, carrying invisible wounds that refused to heal. The city staggered forward on instinct alone, exhausted, grieving, hollowed out. And always hovering just beyond thought was the same question: where had he gone? Some said he was dead, another name swallowed by the pandemic. Others believed he had simply found new hunting grounds. The optimists clung to the idea that whatever compulsion had driven him had finally extinguished itself. The police had nothing, no trail, no suspect, no face. They had imprisoned the wrong men, and everyone knew it. The real killer had become something worse than a criminal. He had become a rumor. And in August of 1919, the rumor took shape again. Sarah Lemon was the wife of a druggist. She lived comfortably, far from the cramped quarters above grocery stores. She was not Italian. She was not part of the pattern. Which is why what happened next shattered every assumption. On the morning of August 3rd, she was found in her bed, her skull crushed by an axe. She clung to life just long enough to be rushed to the hospital, her body broken, her mind fractured. She survived, but memory did not. She recalled waking to pain and darkness, a presence. Then nothing. The back door told the rest of the story. A section carefully removed, entry gained without force. The signature had returned. the Axeman was back. And this time he had changed the rules. If he could strike here, outside the old boundaries, then no one was safe. The city's brief sense of relief collapsed into something worse than fear. Certainty, then in early September, another shock rippled outward. Rosie Cortamiglia, the woman whose testimony had condemned an innocent father and son, came forward. She went not to the police, but to the same newsroom that had once carried the killer's words. Standing beneath buzzing lights and staring into the weight of her own guilt, she confessed. She had lied. Her neighbors had not murdered her child. They had not attacked her family. She admitted the accusation had grown from jealousy, resentment, and grief that demanded a target. 2 innocent men had paid for that lie with years of their lives. They were released immediately. They walked out of prison free but destroyed, their names forever stained. And the confession confirmed what the city already knew deep down. The true killer had never been caught, and he was still hunting. The final known attack came in the early hours of October 27, 1919. Mike Pepitone was 41 years old, a husband, a father of 6. An Italian grocer running a modest shop at the corner of Scott and Algiers streets. His family lived behind the store, close, crowded, alive. Just before dawn, his wife woke to movement, a struggle. In the dimness, she saw a figure standing over her husband's bed. Tall, broad, dressed in dark clothing, something long glinted in his hands. Before she could scream, the figure turned and fled. Footsteps thundered through the house. A door opened, closed, silence. She rushed to her husband. His head had been split open by an axe. Blood coated the bed, the floor, the walls. He was still breathing ragged, wet gasps, but the damage was beyond repair. The children woke to their mother's screams and ran into the room. They would never forget what they saw. The children saw everything. They saw the blood spreading across the floor. They saw the axe, their own, taken from the woodpile behind the store, lying where it had been dropped. And they saw their father dying. Mike Pepitone never reached the hospital. His breathing slowed, then stopped, as his 6 children watched the life leave him. The night sealed itself into their memory, permanent and unforgiving. Outside, the back door told its familiar story, careful, deliberate, silent. When Esther Pepitone spoke with police, her voice shook, but her description did not. She had seen the killer, if only for seconds, tall, heavy-set, dressed in dark clothing. It was the same description given more than a year earlier by Joseph Romano's nieces. At last, there was consistency, but consistency was not enough. In a city of thousands, it described too many men. And by the time statements were written and sketches debated, the killer had already done what he always did. He vanished. After Mike Pepitone's murder, the violence simply stopped. No new victims. No messages, no doors opened in the night. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The city waited, trapped in a permanent flinch. Every noise after dark felt like a warning. Every shadow stretched too long. Every stranger lingering near a storefront became a potential threat. But nothing happened. Autumn gave way to winter. Winter bled into the spring of 1920. Still nothing. Slowly, hesitantly, New Orleans began to believe the impossible, that it was over, that the thing haunting its nights had finally disappeared. Whether by death, distance, or exhaustion, the result was the same. The city lived on, but for one family there would be no ending. For Esther Pepitone and her 6 children there was no peace, only absence. A husband gone, a father erased, a killer who had never been punished. Grief settled in, and then it changed. Over time, grief hardened into something sharper. Rage. On December 7, 1920, more than a year after her husband's murder, Esther Pepitone was walking down a street in Los Angeles. She had moved west with her children, hoping distance could dull memory, hoping a new city might offer escape. Then she saw him, a man approaching from the opposite direction. Tall, heavy-set. Familiar in a way that made her blood turn cold. She knew him instantly. The way he walked, the way he carried himself, the shape he had cut in the darkness of her bedroom. This was the man she had seen standing over her husband with an axe. Esther did not hesitate. She drew a handgun from her purse, a weapon she had carried every day since the night Mike died, and fired. Again and again, in full daylight, in front of witnesses. The man collapsed onto the sidewalk and died there. Esther remained standing. She waited for the police. At trial, she told her story plainly. She named the man she had killed. She said he was the one who had terrorized New Orleans. That justice had failed, that she had simply finished what the city could not. She was convicted of murder, sentenced to 10 years. She served 3, but the question lingered unanswered and corrosive. Was she right? The man she killed, Joseph Mumphrey, was no stranger to violence. His record stretched long with arrests for burglary, assault, and robbery. He was connected to organized crime. He was capable of brutality, and his history raised unsettling coincidences. Records showed he had been imprisoned during long gaps between the Axeman's attacks, most notably the quiet period from late 1918 into early 1919. He was released shortly before the killings resumed. After Mike Pepitone's murder, Mumphrey left New Orleans for Los Angeles. The attacks ended when he did. On paper, it fit too well, but cracks appeared the closer investigators looked. Mumphrey had been incarcerated during several confirmed attacks in the summer of 1918. If he was behind bars, he could not have committed them, unless there was more than one killer. And there was no evidence of that. His criminal past showed no fascination with axes, no ritualistic violence, no theatrical flair. He was a thug, not a mythmaker. And the timeline, while suggestive, was not perfect. So the mystery remains. Did Esther Pepitone gun down a demon in human form, or did grief and memory merge into something tragically mistaken? Did the Axeman die on a Los Angeles sidewalk, or did he simply slip away one final time? The truth has never been proven, and perhaps that is the most fitting end of all. There are gaps in the story that will never close. Some attacks occurred during periods when Joseph Mumphrey's whereabouts could not be confirmed. Others happened when records suggest he was somewhere else entirely. No fingerprints tied him to an axe. No witness ever identified his face in a lineup. No weapon carried his name. All that remained was the testimony of a widow, someone who had glimpsed a figure in the dark for only seconds, in the most traumatic moment of her life. So the question lingers, heavy and unresolved. Was Esther Pepitone right? Or did grief sharpen her memory into a weapon, forcing a face onto a shadow simply because she needed someone to blame? Joseph Mumphrey is gone. He can no longer deny it. He can no longer confess. And the Axeman, whether Mumphrey or someone else entirely, carried his truth into silence. That much is certain. After Mike Pepitone's murder, the attacks stopped. Why? Because the killer died, because he fled, because he was imprisoned for another crime, or because whatever hunger drove him had finally been satisfied. We don't know. What we are left with is a trail of brutality without resolution. At least a dozen people attacked, at least 6 killed, doors carved open in the night, axes lifted from victims' own homes. A letter that turned fear into ritual and forced an entire city to dance, and a mystery that refuses to die. More than a century later, the Axeman of New Orleans still whispers from the margins of history. Who was he? Why did he choose those victims? Why the axe? Why the letter? Why jazz? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, did he truly disappear, or did he simply succeed in becoming something eternal? Decades have passed. Generations of detectives, journalists, Historians and obsessive amateurs have chased this case through archives and alleyways. And despite all of it, despite the records, the witness accounts, the letter itself, we are no closer to certainty than the police were in 1919. This is the curse of the Axeman. There is too much information, and none of it resolves cleanly. Every theory fractures under scrutiny. Every suspect dissolves into doubt. Either the killer was extraordinarily careful or unimaginably lucky, or both. So let us walk through the leading explanations, one by one, and examine why each ultimately fails to fully explain what happened in New Orleans between 1918 and 1919. Theory 1. Joseph Mumfre. The most emotionally satisfying answer is often the most dangerous. Mumfre fits just well enough to tempt belief. His criminal record overlaps with periods of silence. He was violent. He had underworld ties. He left the city after the final murder. Esther Pepitone believed without hesitation that he was the man she saw, and when he died, the killings ended. But belief is not proof. He was incarcerated during several confirmed attacks. There is no physical evidence connecting him to a single crime scene. His history shows brutality, yes, but nothing resembling the Axeman's ritualistic, theatrical pattern. And Esther's identification, made under unimaginable trauma, was based on seconds in darkness. The Mumfre theory endures because it offers closure. A name, a face, an ending, but closure built on circumstantial evidence is fragile. Was he the Axeman? Possibly. But certainty remains out of reach. Theory 2, organized crime. Another explanation rises naturally from the pattern of victims. Early 20th century New Orleans had a strong Italian immigrant population and an active criminal underworld. Many of the victims were Italian grocers, small business owners, people who handled cash and lived where they worked. The theory suggests punishment, protection money unpaid, warnings ignored, fear used as leverage. The violence, according to this view, was a message meant to ripple through the community, a demonstration of what happens when demands are refused. There is some support for this idea. Most early victims shared cultural and occupational ties. Organized crime did operate protection schemes. Some aspects of the attacks, the patience, the confidence, the ability to disappear, suggest professional criminals. But the theory collapses under closer examination. Nothing was stolen. No demands were delivered. No follow-up messages offered a way out. And the letter does not read like organized crime. It reads like performance, like ego, like someone enjoying the sound of their own voice. And then there is jazz. No syndicate demands a city dance at midnight. The deeper we look, the more the case resists explanation. Every answer creates new questions. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of the Axeman, not just the lives he took, but the certainty he denied. He vanished without confession, without consequence, without explanation, leaving behind only echoes and a city that still listens. Each theory tries to tame the horror, each one fails. The organized crime explanation, once popular, begins to collapse the closer it is examined. Yes, the violence carried a ritualistic rhythm, but ritual alone does not equal syndicate. Criminal organizations prefer efficiency. A gunshot in the street, a beating in an alley, a bomb beneath a table, not patience, not silence. Not a man standing in the dark, chiseling wood for long minutes while a family sleeps a few feet away. Why carve a door when you could kick it in? Why risk discovery when speed is everything? Why announce yourself in ink wrapped in theatrical menace? Publicity is poison to organized crime. And then there are the details that simply cannot be ignored. Nothing was ever stolen. No warnings were issued, no demands followed, and children were killed. That alone breaks the pattern. Mary Cortamiglia's death does not fit the logic of intimidation or enforcement. Neither does the attack on Sarah Lemon, who had no connection, cultural, financial, or social, to the Italian business community. If this was about money, why leave it behind? The mafia theory fails not because it lacks imagination, but because the Axeman's cruelty was too strange, too personal, too theatrical. This was not business, it was obsession. Which leads to the explanation most modern criminologists reluctantly circle back to. Theory 3, a serial killer, a lone predator, not driven by profit or revenge but by compulsion. The evidence aligns disturbingly well. Repeated attacks, a consistent method, victims chosen not for who they were but for where and how they lived, homes breached at night. Bodies violated in intimate spaces, bedrooms, beds, sleep. The letter itself reads like a textbook example of dominance and control, a voice demanding attention, mocking authority. Reshaping fear into performance, the need to be seen without being caught, the need to orchestrate. Serial killers often escalate, then pause, then vanish through death, incarceration, or psychological collapse. And yet, even this explanation fractures under pressure. The victims were not perfectly consistent. The long gaps between attacks defy common patterns. No trophies were taken, no bodies staged, and the letter, especially the letter, stands apart. Few killers in history have written anything so elaborate, so confident, so mythic. The serial killer theory may be the closest to the truth, but it does not explain everything. Some researchers have proposed something even more unsettling. Theory 4, multiple killers, not one Axeman, but several. The first attack inspires others. Copycats adopt the method. Violence spreads, then burns out as quickly as it ignites. This could explain inconsistencies, shifting victim profiles, long silences, a permanent end without resolution. But the method was too specific. Chiseling door panels is not instinctive. It requires time, planning, tools, and nerve. Copycats usually make mistakes, changes in technique, sloppiness, deviations that expose them. That never happened. The consistency was too precise, the patience too uniform. And the letter speaks with a single voice. One intelligence, one ego. The copycat theory is tempting but unlikely, which leaves the final explanation. The one whispered in candle-lit rooms and prayed against behind locked doors. Theory 5, the supernatural, not because it is true, but because it mattered. In 1919 New Orleans, evil was not always metaphorical. Catholicism, folk belief, voodoo, and spiritualism coexisted openly. Spirits were not abstractions. Curses were not jokes. When a killer claimed to be a demon, some believed him. The letter encouraged it. The disappearances reinforced it. The motiveless cruelty deepened it. He came without warning. He vanished without trace. He stopped as suddenly as he began. To many, that felt otherworldly. But belief does not equal reality. Axes are physical, doors were cut by hands, wood splintered. Blood spilled. There is no such thing as demons, only people who seem monstrous when they are never caught. The supernatural theory tells us less about the killer and more about the fear he created. And so we arrive at the only honest conclusion. We will never know. Too much time has passed. Evidence is gone. Witnesses are dead. Records are incomplete. Every answer fractures into doubt the moment it is touched. The Axeman left behind bodies, silence, and questions. And perhaps that was the final victory. Because long after the blood dried and the music faded, the mystery endured. Still does. Time has erased the living witnesses. Their voices are gone, their memories buried. Their fear carried only in ink and rumor. The case is frozen forever. We do not know his name, we do not know his face. We do not know where he came from or where he went when he vanished into the dark. We do not know why he began, and we do not know why he stopped. All that remains is the shadow he cast. The testimony of people who trembled in the aftermath, a letter that bent an entire city to its will, graves that never received justice, and the music. That strange, unsettling, almost beautiful memory of a single night when an entire city filled the darkness with sound, not to celebrate, but to survive. The Axeman of New Orleans no longer walks the streets, but he never truly left. He became a legend woven permanently into the city's darker mythology. His story has been revisited again and again, reshaped for books, films, and retellings across generations. Yet something about this case resists glorification. He is not romantic, not clever, not fascinating in the way some killers are dangerously framed. His violence was random, his motives opaque, his cruelty pointless. There is nothing to admire here. What makes this story endure is not the man, but the letter. That document transformed a series of murders into something far stranger, something theatrical, a performance staged on a citywide scale. He understood something essential about fear. You don't need to be inside someone's home to terrorize them. You only need to make them believe you could be. By speaking directly to the people, by placing himself in their kitchens, their bedrooms, their thoughts, he turned every citizen into a potential victim. That is his true legacy, not the bodies. But the fear, the way he made an entire city move to his rhythm. But there is one more truth that must be spoken. Because behind the mystery, behind the theories, the speculation, the myth, there are real people, real families, lives broken in ways that did not fade when the headlines stopped. Too often the killer becomes the focus. His identity, his psychology, his cleverness, his words. And in doing so, the victims become background noise. That cannot happen here. They are not footnotes. They are the heart of this tragedy. Between 1918 and 1919, the Axeman attacked at least 12 people. At least 6 of them died. These numbers are incomplete. Some attacks may never have been reported. Others may have been misattributed, lost to history's silence. But we know some names, and they deserve to be spoken. Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Husband and wife, immigrants, grocers, hard workers who lived above their store and believed in routine and safety. They were attacked in their bed in May of 1918. They never had a chance. Harriet Lowe, she lived with Louis Bessumer. She was attacked in June of 1918 and died days later. Her final words, confused and fevered, spoken in agony, destroyed an innocent life. She deserves understanding, not blame. Mary Cortimiglia, 2 years old, a child, killed on August 5, 1918, her skull crushed by an axe meant for adults. Her death stands as the most senseless, the most unforgivable act in this entire series. Joseph Romano, an elderly grocer, attacked in August of 1918. He lingered for 2 days before dying. His nieces saw the killer flee into the night and carried that image forever. Mike Pepitone, a husband, a father of 6, attacked in October of 1919. He died in front of his children. His widow would later take a life believing, rightly or wrongly, that she was ending the nightmare herself. And there were survivors, people who woke screaming. People who lived with broken bodies and shattered sleep. People who carried the fear long after the city tried to forget. This is what the Axeman left behind, not legend, loss.
Some of them lived. And in many ways, that was its own kind of sentence. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia survived the night that took their daughter. They woke every day knowing the sound of an axe had ended a life that had barely begun. Louis Bessumer lived with the knowledge that he had been caged for a crime he did not commit, his name dragged through blood and suspicion. Sarah Lehman survived with a body broken and a memory shattered, forever trapped between what she felt and what she could never fully remember. And there were others. Men and women whose names were never printed. Who survived attacks that never made headlines. Who carried the terror quietly for the rest of their lives. These were not characters in a mystery. They were real people. They had families. Futures. Ordinary mornings and plans for tomorrow. None of them deserved what happened. None of them could have prevented it. And yet the questions remain. Was the Axeman Joseph Mumfry gunned down by a grieving widow on a Los Angeles sidewalk? Was he an enforcer sent to terrify a community? A lone predator driven by compulsions no one ever understood? Or something else entirely, something we have never even considered? Was the letter truly written by the killer, or by someone exploiting panic for their own ends? The police believed it was genuine, but certainty died with the witnesses. Why Italian grocers? Why axes taken from their own homes? Why jazz? Why stop? We will never know. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The human mind craves endings. We want a face. A motive. A final answer that makes the suffering make sense. But some stories refuse resolution. Some monsters are never unmasked. Sometimes, they simply walk away. But there is one moment in this story that rises above the blood and the fear. One moment that reveals something quietly extraordinary. On the night of March 19, 1919, New Orleans was given an impossible choice. Obey a killer or risk death. Hide in silence or dare to be seen. Panic would have been understandable. Flight would have been rational. Instead, the city chose music. An entire population turned terror into sound. They opened doors. They lit windows. They played and danced and sang, not because they believed it would save them forever, but because it was the only answer they had. They took the weapon their tormentor named and transformed it into defiance. For one night, fear did not win. No, jazz did not stop the killing. Mike Pepitone would die months later, proof that music was never protection. But for those hours, the city showed something rare. Unity. Resilience. The refusal to face the dark alone. That night, New Orleans became more than a collection of victims. It became a testament to community, to stubborn courage, to the strange beauty that can emerge when people stand together against the inexplicable. The Axeman wanted to be remembered as a demon, as an unstoppable force, as the worst spirit that ever existed. But that is not what endured. What endured was the music. The night a city refused to die quietly. The night fear was drowned out by rhythm. The night death did not get the final word. The Axeman killed at least 6 people. He terrorized the city. He wrote one of the most disturbing letters in criminal history. And then he vanished, taking his name, his motives, and his truth with him. More than a century later, we still don't know who he was. But we do know who mattered. Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Mary Cortimiglia. Joseph Romano. Mike Pepitone. Harriet Lowe. The survivors. The families left behind. They deserved more than to become footnotes to an unsolved mystery. So remember them. Remember that behind every unanswered crime are real lives, real grief, real scars that history cannot close. And remember that night in March, when a city faced a monster with nothing but music, and for a moment, won. Some evils are never named. But neither are they allowed to define us.